The private room was drenched in dim neon light, the air heavy with smoke and perfume, the muffled bass of the KTV below rattling through the floor. Richard sat on the edge of the sofa, his posture straight despite the whiskey that scorched his throat. He had always been careful, always maintained dignity no matter how casually Susan toyed with him, but tonight her cruelty cut deeper than any blade. She dangled a keycard in front of his face, the corners of her lips curved upward in a mocking smile that never reached her eyes. "Go upstairs, Richard," she whispered, her voice coated in sweetness and poison alike. "There's a client waiting. Make her happy for me, and I'll consider giving you something in return." Her best friend laughed from the side, fanning the smoke away as though this humiliation were entertainment. Richard's fingers twitched, but he didn't reach for the card. For 3 years he had followed Susan through storms and shadows, standing beside her when others abandoned her, refusing to touch the credit card she kept locked in her drawer because he wanted her love, not her money. And still, tonight, she stood here, reducing him to nothing more than a bargaining chip. His jaw tightened. He remembered nights when Susan would curl up in his arms like a frightened child, trembling at the sound of thunder, and he had run through rain barefoot just to comfort her. He remembered the time she had casually mentioned snow, and he had flown into a blizzard to bring her a handful in his palms. None of it mattered now. Susan's eyes gleamed, catching the dim light as she leaned closer, her perfume suffocating. She hooked her finger under his chin as she always did, that mocking gesture she used as if he were her pet, not her partner. "Don't look at me like that," she teased. "Isn't this what you're good for, obedience?" Her voice carried a sharpness hidden beneath playfulness, as though she dared him to refuse. His throat burned again, but this time not from alcohol, burned from anger he forced down like fire. Across the room, her phone buzzed. Richard caught the faint voice of Joseph, her first love, seeping through the speaker. "Make him do it," Joseph commanded, "then I'll believe you don't care for him." Something inside Richard cracked, his chest tightened as though a vice gripped his ribs, his stomach coiling in pain. For years, every small act of devotion had been an attempt to bridge the distance between them, but she had never let him reach her. She had compared him to Joseph at every turn, as though Richard's love and loyalty were worth nothing against Joseph's indifference. And now, to prove her loyalty to Joseph, she was offering Richard like a pawn in a negotiation. The humiliation was unbearable. He rose from the sofa, towering over Susan, his shadow falling across her flawless makeup and fox-like eyes. "Susan," he said, his voice low, controlled, though inside he trembled with rage. "What do you take me for?" She tilted her head, lips curving, eyes cold. "A toy," she replied softly. "A useful one, as long as you perform. And if not?" She shrugged, her smile widening. "You're replaceable." Richard stared at her, unable to reconcile this heartless woman with the girl he had once believed in, the one who had once held his hand as if she'd never let go. His hands shook as he took the card from her, not because he accepted the role she shoved him into, but because in that instant, something inside him shattered. A bitter smile tugged at his lips as he turned toward the door. "As you wish," he murmured, forcing each word past the burning in his throat. The whiskey churned in his stomach, acid rising, but the pain almost felt cleansing. He knew then, this was the last time. Behind him, Susan's voice rose, sharp and trembling. "Richard, wait!" But he didn't. The door closed on her words, sealing them behind him like the end of a prayer left unanswered. For 3 years, he had given her everything, even the pieces of himself he couldn't replace. Now, in this single moment of betrayal, she had stripped him of love, stripped him of dignity, and left him standing alone in the ruins of what they once were. He clenched the keycard in his hand, the edges biting into his skin, and walked down the hallway, knowing the man who had walked in here tonight would not be the same one who walked out. Richard Key had always carried himself with a restraint that bordered on silence. To outsiders, he seemed like the type of man who lived in the shadow of stronger personalities, a quiet figure lingering behind Susan Lynn's dazzling beauty and sharp tongue. But those who looked closer, though few ever did, would have seen the discipline in his gaze, the steadiness in his hands, and the way his shoulders carried burdens without complaint. From the time he was young, Richard had been raised not just with privilege, but with expectation. His father, the chairman of a sprawling family conglomerate, had intended for Richard to be polished into a diamond, unyielding, flawless, and destined to rule. Yet Richard had resisted this fate quietly, preferring anonymity, even humility, to the suffocating weight of legacy. When he first met Susan, she had no idea of his background. That was how he wanted it. He never mentioned the mansions, the chauffeured cars, or the endless resources at his disposal. Instead, he appeared as an ordinary man, a man who brought her coffee when she was working late, who held an umbrella for her during storms, who saved every penny of his own allowance to buy her small, meaningful gifts. To him, hiding his identity was not a deception but a preservation. He wanted her to love him as Richard, not as the chairman's son. He wanted something genuine in a life where everything else was predetermined. For 3 years, he dedicated himself to Susan. He endured her sharp remarks, her dismissive laughter when her friends teased that he was her little puppy. He endured the whispers in their social circle that he must be after her money since she was known for being lavish with those who hovered around her. The reality was the opposite. Every card she gave him, every luxury watch, every limited edition sneaker remained untouched in a drawer. The only thing he had ever kept from her was a small sketchbook of her childhood drawings, something she had once tossed away absent-mindedly. He treasured it because it was the only gift of sincerity she had ever offered him, even if she hadn't meant to. Richard's devotion was not silent weakness, it was sacrifice. He had gone to war with his own father, who accused him of wasting himself on a woman who would never love him back. He had endured the cold stares of his family, who wondered why the heir to an empire was humiliating himself for a woman who openly pined for another man. Yet Richard held on, telling himself that patience and kindness could mend any wound, that one day Susan would look at him and finally see the man who had always stood by her side. Susan Lynn, however, was not a woman easily moved by sacrifice. Beautiful, cunning, and ambitious, she carried the sharp edges of someone who had clawed her way out of hardship and refused to ever return. To the world, she was the picture of grace, the poised executive who commanded respect in boardrooms, the woman whose laughter lit up any gathering, the ambitious daughter who proved herself indispensable. But in private, with Richard, she was often careless, manipulative, even cruel. She treated his silence as passivity, his patience as servitude, his devotion as something that would never run out. She never saw the toll it took on him to hold her when she cried Joseph's name in her sleep. She never noticed the way his jaw tightened when she brought up her first love in casual conversation, praising Joseph's intellect, his charm, his potential. Joseph had been a shadow in their relationship from the very beginning. No matter how many years had passed, no matter how indifferent Joseph appeared toward her, Susan's heart never fully left him. Richard could feel it in the way she spoke of Joseph's return from abroad, in the way her eyes lit it with a spark she had never given Richard, in the way her voice softened when she whispered Joseph's name. Richard could give her the world, but Joseph's absence carried more weight than Richard's constant presence ever did, and Susan wielded that imbalance like a weapon, often comparing them without mercy. Joseph never needed anyone's help, she once said, her words sharp as glass. He's strong, capable, a man of vision. Richard, you're safe. Too safe. Sometimes I think you'd rather live as my shadow than as yourself. Each barb chipped away at him, yet Richard endured. He told himself that love required patience, that one day she would tire of chasing a ghost and finally see the man in front of her. But deep down, the humiliation festered, and with it, a quiet rage. It was in the middle of this growing storm that Margaret Chen entered his orbit. Margaret was not the kind of woman who sought attention. She carried herself with an understated elegance, her almond-shaped eyes hiding stories she rarely spoke aloud. As the daughter of another influential family, she had been forced to inherit responsibilities far earlier than most. Her father's sudden stroke had left her at the helm of a business empire she had not yet been ready for, and though she had proven herself capable, she carried scars. Scars not just from corporate battles, but from betrayal. Richard first encountered Margaret during a tense dinner arranged by his father. At that time, Richard was still in Susan's grasp, still playing the role of her obedient lover. Margaret, seated across the table, had regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and restraint. She had heard the rumors, of course, that Susan kept a boy toy, that Richard was merely another ornament in her collection, but Margaret's gaze lingered too long, as if she sensed the unspoken truth beneath the surface. Later, when they were left alone for a moment, she offered him a glass of wine and said softly, "It must be difficult, being misunderstood." The word startled Richard. Few had ever acknowledged the quiet dignity with which he endured Susan's scorn. Margaret didn't elaborate, and he didn't respond, but something passed between them in that instant, a recognition of shared wounds. He didn't yet know the full story of her past, how a man she had once trusted had betrayed her for profit, but he could see the shadow in her eyes. She, too, knew what it meant to give sincerity and receive cruelty in return. Margaret never overstepped, never intruded, but her presence was like a mirror held up to Richard's pain. Where Susan's touch scorched him with humiliation, Margaret's glance steadied him. Where Susan mocked him for silence, Margaret respected it. Where Susan belittled, Margaret understood. At first, he resisted the comfort her quiet strength offered, out of loyalty, out of stubbornness, but as Susan's obsession with Joseph grew sharper, Richard found himself thinking of Margaret more often than he dared admit. In Susan's world, Richard was the toy she flaunted and dismissed, the man she could bend and twist at will. In Joseph's shadow, Richard was invisible, insignificant, easily discarded. But in Margaret's eyes, even in the briefest moments, Richard was seen. That difference, though small at first, would become the thread he held on to when everything else was stripped from him. For now, though, he remained bound to Susan, his devotion unbroken, his sacrifices unnoticed. Every day, he woke with the hope that this would be the day she softened, that this would be the day she stopped saying Joseph's name and started saying his. And every night, he went to sleep with the bitter taste of disappointment. He held onto the sketchbook, flipping through childish drawings of a girl and boy holding hands, running from shadows together. In those faded pages, he clung to the memory of the girl Susan once was, the girl who had once promised never to let go. But the woman she had become was far different. The woman she had become was willing to push him into another woman's room, to use him as a pawn for her own ambitions, to humiliate him in ways that would scar his pride forever. And Richard, though still silent, had begun to feel the weight of a storm gathering inside him, a storm that no patience, no devotion, no sacrifice could hold back forever. The banquet hall glittered with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors, every surface reflecting the grandeur of the evening. Susan walked at Richard's side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, but to anyone watching closely, it was not affection that bound her there, it was possession. She moved with confidence, her laughter perfectly timed, her gaze scanning the room for Joseph. Richard felt it in the way her body shifted, the subtle anticipation in her movements. Tonight was not about them, never about them. Tonight was about proving something to Joseph, about showing him she was indispensable, even if it meant reducing Richard to a stage prop. When Margaret approached their table, calm and composed in her beige silk dress, Susan's eyes lit with something calculating. Richard noticed the flicker immediately. He had learned to read Susan's expressions the way a soldier reads the battlefield, each shift of her lips or narrowing of her eyes signaling what was to come. Susan leaned closer to him, her perfume washing over him like suffocation. "Richard," she murmured softly enough for only him to hear. "Be a dear and keep Margaret entertained tonight. She's important for tomorrow's deal, make her feel comfortable." Richard froze, his hand tightening around his glass. It was not the request itself that burned, but the casual cruelty behind it. Susan had reduced him from her partner to a pawn, a tool to be used for her convenience. He looked at her, searching for even a flicker of the woman who once clung to him during thunderstorms, whispering that he made her feel safe. But all he saw was the cold sharpness in her eyes, the unshakable confidence that he would obey. Margaret, oblivious to the exchange, smiled politely. Richard forced a nod, masking the humiliation that clawed at his chest. He had long grown used to being belittled by Susan, but tonight it cut deep because Joseph was in the room. Across the hall, Joseph stood among a circle of executives, his posture relaxed, his expression bored but confident. Even from here, Richard could see Susan's eyes drawn to him, the faint blush that rose to her cheeks whenever Joseph's gaze wandered in her direction. Joseph barely acknowledged her presence, yet that indifference only heightened Susan's obsession. Richard had been with her for 3 years, giving her everything he could, his time, his devotion, even his rebellion against his own father's expectations, and yet, in Joseph's shadow, Richard was nothing more than a placeholder. Susan's fixation was unrelenting, she compared them openly, sometimes cruelly. Joseph would never waste time like this, she once snapped when Richard suggested a weekend getaway. Joseph always knew how to charm people. You just sit there, silent, invisible. The words replayed in his mind now as she pushed him toward Margaret, as though his dignity were a currency she could spend without consequence. Margaret noticed his hesitation. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze soft but piercing. "You don't have to," she said under her breath when Susan was distracted. The words were simple, but Richard heard the weight behind them. Margaret was not blind. She saw the tension, the humiliation, the fracture in Richard's composure, yet he smiled faintly, shaking his head. "It's fine," he whispered back. It wasn't fine, but he had long convinced himself that love required endurance. Later that evening, the situation escalated. The group had moved to a more private lounge, drinks flowing freely, laughter echoing off the walls. Susan, flushed with alcohol, leaned back against the sofa, her hand draped lazily over Richard's shoulder as if staking her claim. But her words betrayed her. "Richard," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "why don't you show Margaret how attentive you can be? You're good at that, aren't you?" The smirk on her lips made his stomach churn. The others chuckled awkwardly, Margaret's expression tightening. Richard felt the heat rise to his face, not from alcohol, but from shame. He looked at Susan, his eyes silently begging her to stop, but she only tilted her chin higher, daring him to protest. Across the room, Joseph watched with detached amusement, sipping his drink as though this spectacle were nothing more than casual entertainment. Richard forced himself to stand, his dignity unraveling thread by thread. He offered Margaret a drink, his movements precise, almost mechanical. Margaret's eyes met his, filled with something between pity and respect. She accepted the glass but shook her head subtly, silently urging him not to debase himself further. But Richard pressed on, because behind the humiliation was a simple, painful truth. He loved Susan. Despite her cruelty, despite her fixation on Joseph, despite the way she carved away at his pride, he still loved her. And so he bore it, swallowing the bitterness, locking it away in the same place where he had buried every cruel word she had ever spoken. But inside, something was changing. The fracture was small at first, a hairline crack in the fortress of patience he had built. It came when he caught Susan's eyes lingering on Joseph for too long, when he heard her laugh at Joseph's dry remark in a way she never laughed at his. It came when she dismissed his sacrifices with a careless wave of her hand, when she treated his devotion as a given, not a gift. That fracture widened tonight, with every humiliating word she spoke, with every command that turned him into an object. Margaret, sensitive to the unspoken, leaned closer during a lull in the conversation. "You don't deserve this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. Her words hit him harder than Susan's cruelty because they carried truth. For 3 years, Richard had endured in silence, telling himself that love was worth the pain. But for the first time, he wondered if he was wrong. Susan noticed their exchange and her smile faltered. For a fleeting moment, jealousy flickered across her face, but it was quickly smothered by arrogance. She clinked her glass against Joseph's, laughing too loudly, as though to remind Richard of where her heart truly belonged. The message was clear: no matter how much he gave, no matter how much he endured, Joseph would always come first. Richard sat back, the laughter around him fading into a dull roar. He looked at Susan, really looked at her, and saw not the girl who once held his hand, but the woman who now held his pride hostage. His love for her had always been stronger than his anger, but tonight, for the first time, the balance shifted. Love was still there, but beneath it, something darker stirred: resentment, the seed of rebellion. He clenched his fist around his glass, the cool crystal grounding him. He wasn't ready to walk away, not yet. But the man who sat there in silence, swallowing humiliation for love, was beginning to die. In his place, something new was forming, something sharper, stronger, unwilling to be broken again. The night wore on, and Susan continued her game, unaware that with every careless word, every cruel command, she was dismantling the devotion Richard had built brick by brick. He watched her laugh with Joseph, watched her bask in the attention she had always craved, and felt the last threads of his patience unravel. By the time the evening ended, Richard's silence was no longer the silence of love, it was the silence of a storm gathering strength. The night after the banquet, Richard lay in his apartment staring at the ceiling, the city lights leaking through the blinds and painting fractured patterns on the floor. The taste of whiskey still lingered on his tongue, bitter and heavy, but no drink could drown the humiliation that had settled in his chest. He had borne it silently as always, the smile fixed on his lips while Susan flaunted her obsession with Joseph, but in the stillness of his room, the mask dissolved, every word replayed in his mind, like echoes in a cavern. "Show Margaret how attentive you can be, you're good at that, aren't you?" He had thought his heart could withstand anything Susan hurled at him. For 3 years, he had carried her cruelty as if it were a burden worth shouldering. Every cutting remark, every dismissal, every comparison to Joseph, he endured it all because he believed in her, because he believed that beneath her cold exterior lingered the girl he once knew. But tonight, he questioned whether that girl had ever truly existed. His mind slipped back to a different time, when life had been simpler, harsher, yet strangely purer. He was a boy again, standing in a muddy alley with bruises blooming across his arms. Older kids had cornered him, mocking him for his family's sudden fall from grace, jeering at the boy who had gone from privilege to poverty overnight. Just as the first fist swung, a small figure darted forward, Susan. Her hair was tied back messily, her clothes worn thin, but her eyes blazed with defiance. She grabbed his hand, tugged him hard, and together they sprinted through the winding streets. She knew every shortcut, every hidden corner, and they lost the bullies within minutes. That was the first time Richard saw her, and in that moment, in the breathless laughter they shared after escaping, he felt a bond stronger than any vow. For weeks, they were inseparable. They begged scraps of food together, shielded each other from the cruelty of the world, and shared dreams no one else cared to hear. She told him she wanted to escape their lives, to become someone untouchable. He told her that one day he'd make enough money to marry her, to keep her safe forever. She had smiled then, so sincerely, and nodded. "Okay. I'll wait for you." Those words haunted him now. He rolled onto his side, gripping the edge of the blanket until his knuckles whitened. Somewhere along the way, the girl who once held his hand through the darkness had become the woman who pushed him toward another's arms. Somewhere along the way, promises had twisted into weapons, and loyalty had become humiliation. He had built his love on the memory of that girl, but she no longer existed, if she ever had. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Susan glared at him. "Did you behave?" Margaret seemed pleased. "Don't forget tomorrow's meeting." No gratitude, no acknowledgement of his feelings, only a command disguised as casual text. His chest tightened. He wanted to throw the phone across the room, to scream that he wasn't her pawn, that his love was not a leash to tug whenever she wished. But his fingers only locked around the phone until they ached, and then he set it down quietly. Because despite everything, despite the humiliation, he still loved her. Why? He couldn't answer. Was it loyalty to a promise made in childhood? Was it hope that the girl who once saved him would surface again? Or was it simply weakness, a refusal to admit he had wasted 3 years of his life on a woman who never valued him? The following day, Richard attended the meeting arranged with Margaret's company. Susan was radiant, her sharp suit tailored to perfection, her smile polished for business. Joseph sat nearby, effortlessly charming, his confidence filling the room. Richard remained silent as usual, seated slightly behind Susan, allowing her to shine as she always demanded. But Margaret's eyes found him across the table. There was no judgment in them, only quiet understanding. She noticed the way Susan dismissed his input, cutting him off mid-sentence with a wave of her hand. She noticed how Joseph smirked every time Susan agreed with him, as though Richard were invisible. Margaret's gaze lingered, and Richard felt both exposed and seen in a way he hadn't in years. Later, when the meeting ended and the others dispersed, Margaret approached him. Her voice was soft, stripped of corporate formality. "You don't deserve the way she treats you." Richard stiffened. "It's fine." The words came automatically, a reflex born from years of swallowing pain. Margaret shook her head. "No, it isn't." He wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Her words pierced too deeply. Instead, he looked away, his jaw tight. Margaret didn't press further. She only offered a faint smile before walking away, leaving him with silence heavier than any scorn. That night, his dreams returned to childhood again. He dreamt of Susan's small hand gripping his as they ran from bullies, of her promise whispered under the stars that they'd never be apart. But the dream shifted, twisted, until the Susan holding his hand vanished, replaced by the Susan of now, her eyes cold, her lips curled into that mocking smile, her hand shoving him toward Margaret's waiting arms. He woke drenched in sweat, his chest heaving, the memory of betrayal mingling with the ache of longing. Days blurred together, each one a repetition of the same torment. Susan flaunted her obsession with Joseph, sometimes subtly, sometimes cruelly obvious. She laughed at Joseph's jokes with a softness Richard hadn't heard in years. She adjusted Joseph's tie in front of everyone, while Richard stood by, a silent witness. And whenever Richard's gaze lingered too long, Susan would remind him with a smirk, "Don't forget your place, eh?" Margaret appeared in his orbit again during another event. She found him standing alone on a balcony, the city skyline stretching endlessly behind him. He held a glass of wine, untouched. She joined him, her presence unassuming yet grounding. For a long while, they stood in silence, watching the night. "You're breaking inside," she said quietly, not as an accusation but as a truth. Richard's throat tightened. "And if I am?" Her gaze softened. "Then stop letting her cut you open." He closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. "It's not that simple. It never is." Her voice was tinged with sadness, as though she were speaking not just of him, but of herself. "But you'll bleed out if you keep giving yourself to someone who doesn't care." Her words echoed in his mind long after she left. He knew she was right. He knew his devotion had become a noose, tightening each time Susan looked past him, each time she called Joseph's name with longing that she had never given him, and yet, he couldn't let go. Not yet. The humiliation continued, chipping away at him. Susan treated his silence as obedience, his patience as servitude. She never realized that inside him, something was shifting. Love was still there, yes, but entwined with it now was despair, humiliation, and a slow-burning anger that refused to be smothered. He still bore it, still told himself it was love, but the fracture had spread. His dignity, once unshakable, now trembled with every passing day. Richard stared into the mirror one evening, his reflection a stranger's. His eyes were hollow, his jaw clenched, his shoulders slumped not from weakness but from exhaustion. He whispered to himself, "Why wasn't it enough? 3 years, everything I had, why wasn't it enough?" No answer came, only the hollow silence of a man breaking under the weight of unrequited devotion. And still, tomorrow, he would stand by Susan's side again. The morning of the quarterly board meeting carried the kind of tension Richard had grown up with but had kept hidden from Susan all these years. The Chi family conglomerate was a beast spanning real estate, finance, hotels, and technology, a machine that moved markets with a word. Richard had been groomed for this moment since boyhood, yet he had spent 3 years pretending to be ordinary, masking his inheritance beneath plain shirts and quiet gestures. He had done it because he wanted Susan's love untainted by wealth. But tonight, the mask would finally fall. Susan walked into the conference hall brimming with confidence. She had spent the night preparing her department's report, certain this would be her opportunity to rise even further. Joseph strolled beside her, his suit sharp, his smirk sharper. He whispered something that made her laugh softly, though she glanced around as if to make sure Richard wasn't watching. She had grown used to the idea of him as her accessory, useful in private but invisible in public. She hadn't noticed that he wasn't following her into the room. The executives murmured in anticipation. It was a rare occasion when the chairman's son was to appear. Rumors swirled in the air, few had ever seen him in person, and many speculated about what kind of man he was. Susan smoothed her skirt, adjusted her posture, determined to make an impression on this unseen heir. She didn't yet realize that the man she had mocked, belittled, and humiliated would be the one stepping through the doors. The assistant entered first, his voice firm and respectful. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Richard Key, the only son of Chairman Chi." The doors opened, and Richard walked in. For a moment, silence devoured the room. Susan's breath caught in her throat, her body stiffening as though struck. Joseph blinked, his smirk faltering. Richard's presence was different now, his suit tailored to perfection, his dark eyes steady with authority, his shoulders squared with the confidence of someone who knew he belonged at the head of the table. He was no longer the silent man who endured Susan's mockery. He was the heir. Susan rose instinctively, her lips parting. "Richard?" Her voice trembled, caught between disbelief and dread. The assistant continued smoothly, ignoring her. "From this quarter forward, Mr. Chi will be overseeing all departmental reports directly. Please present your work clearly." Richard's gaze swept the room before finally settling on Susan. He didn't smile, didn't flinch, didn't offer her the comfort of familiarity. He only said, "Manager Lin, let's begin with your department." The title, Manager Lin, cut sharper than any blade. Not Susan, not darling, not even the mocking endearments she used on him, just the cold professional title that reminded her she was nothing more than an employee here. Her face drained of color, her hands trembled as she shuffled her papers. She tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Joseph leaned forward, attempting to cover her hesitation. Allow me to assist. Richard's gaze flicked to him, sharp as steel. Mr. Joseph, if you cannot allow your colleague to speak for herself, perhaps you should let someone else take her position. The weight in his tone silenced Joseph instantly. He sat back, his smirk gone, his eyes narrowing with resentment. For the first time, the man who had mocked Richard as a mere boy toy realized he was staring up at someone who now held his career in the palm of his hand. Susan finally managed to stumble through her report, her words rushed and incoherent, her usual confidence was gone, stripped bare by the revelation of Richard's identity. Each time she looked up, his calm, unreadable expression drove another nail into her composure. She thought back to every cruel word she had spoken, every time she had compared him to Joseph, every time she had shoved him into humiliation. Shame crashed over her in waves so heavy she could barely breathe. When the meeting ended, Richard closed his folder with quiet finality. That will be all. Thank you, everyone. His gaze passed over Joseph and Susan without pause, as if they were no more significant than any other subordinate. But Susan couldn't let it end there. As the room emptied, she hurried to him, her heels clicking frantically against the polished floor. Richard, wait! He turned, his expression cool, professional. Manager Lin, do you require clarification on something? Her heart twisted, the distance in his voice was unbearable. You're Chairman Key's son? Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you let me? Richard's lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. Would it have mattered? You never cared for me without the title. Why should the title matter now? Tears welled in her eyes, but she bit them back, her pride warring with her desperation. I didn't know. If you had? Richard stepped closer, his voice lowering, each word laced with the weight of betrayal. If you had known, would you have treated me as more than a toy? Or would you have simply disguised your contempt better? Susan's knees weakened, and she clutched the edge of the table to steady herself. Memories flooded her, every time she mocked him in front of her friends, every cruel comparison to Joseph, every command that reduced him to an object. And now, standing before her, was the man who had borne it all in silence, revealed in his true power. Joseph approached, trying to mask his unease with bravado. Richard, let's be honest, you can't possibly hold grudges over trivial matters. Susan and I. Richard's gaze sliced through him like glass. You presume too much, Joseph. In this company, you are nothing more than an employee. If you think your charm or connections are here, you are mistaken. Joseph's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The realization had sunk in. He was no longer Richard's superior in Susan's eyes, he was Richard's subordinate, and his future hung on Richard's decisions. Susan's superiority shattered completely in that moment. For years, she had comforted herself with the belief that Richard needed her, that she held the power, that she was the one in control. Now she saw the truth. She had toyed with a man who could have given her the world, and in doing so, she had destroyed the only genuine devotion she had ever been offered. Her vision blurred with tears, her voice breaking. Richard, please, I didn't mean. But he raised a hand, silencing her. His eyes, once filled with warmth whenever they met hers, were now cold, impenetrable. Save it, whatever you feel now, it's too late. As he turned to leave, Susan sank into a chair, her body trembling. Her pride, her arrogance, her certainty of control, all of it collapsed around her like a house of cards. For the first time, she felt the weight of true regret, a weight so crushing it stole her breath. Richard didn't look back. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, steady and unshaken, while behind him, Susan broke apart in silence. The confrontation came days later, but the storm had been building for years. Richard had returned to the family offices as his true self, heir to the Chi conglomerate, the man his father had raised him to be. He wore tailored suits now, every line of his posture reflecting the authority he once hid. For the employees, he was a revelation. For Susan, he was a nightmare made flesh. She waited for him outside his office, her once flawless composure frayed. She looked smaller than he remembered, her makeup unable to mask the shadows under her eyes, her lips trembling as if every word she wanted to say turned to ash before leaving her mouth. When Richard arrived, flanked by assistants, she stepped forward. Richard, she whispered, her voice raw, please, can we talk? His eyes swept over her, cold and unreadable. Manager Lin, he said evenly, I don't recall scheduling a meeting with you. The formality cut deeper than any insult. Her breath caught, but she forced herself to follow him into the office. The door closed, leaving them alone. For a moment, the silence was suffocating. Susan clasped her hands tightly, as if holding herself together. "I was wrong," she blurted at last, her voice breaking. "I didn't know who you really were. I didn't know what you carried. If I had—" Richard's laugh was sharp, bitter. "If you had known I was wealthy, you would have played the role of a loving girlfriend more convincingly. You would have hidden your contempt better. Don't insult me with excuses, Susan. You didn't need to know my background to treat me with decency." Her eyes welled with tears. She took a step closer, desperation clawing at her chest. "I was scared, Richard. Do you understand? My whole life I've been running, from poverty, from shame, from being nothing. Joseph represented the world I thought I wanted: intelligence, prestige, respectability. I thought if I held on to him, I could erase my past, but with you—" Her voice cracked. "With you, I couldn't control myself. You made me feel things I didn't want to feel. I mocked you, pushed you away, because I was terrified of needing you." Richard stared at her, his expression unyielding. "Needing me? You didn't need me, Susan. You used me. You held me close when it was convenient, when you needed comfort in the dark, and when Joseph returned, you shoved me aside like I was nothing." He stepped closer, his voice rising with every word. "Do you remember when you handed me that hotel key card? Do you remember telling me to go to another woman's room like I was some plaything you could barter?" Susan flinched, her knees weakening. "I didn't mean it. I was angry. Angry," Richard's voice thundered. "Angry enough to strip me of dignity, angry enough to push the man who gave you 3 years of devotion into another woman's bed for a business deal. I ran through storms for you, Susan. I flew into a blizzard to bring you snow when you said you wanted to see it. I stood against my own father to protect you, and still, you looked at Joseph with more warmth than you ever gave me." Her tears spilled freely now. She sank to her knees, clutching his trousers as if the physical touch could tether him to her. "Please, Richard, I know I was cruel. I know I didn't cherish you the way I should have, but I love you. I do. I was blind, obsessed, broken, but I love you. Don't leave me, please." Richard pulled her hands away, his touch firm, but not cruel. He looked down at her, his dark eyes glinting with pain and finality. "No, Susan. You don't love me. You loved the control you had over me. You loved the devotion you could squander without consequence. You loved knowing I would always come back, no matter how deep you cut, but you never cherished me, not once." His voice dropped, soft yet sharp, enough to pierce her soul. "And I can't love someone who never saw me as more than a toy." The door opened then, and Margaret entered quietly, carrying a folder. She froze at the sight of Susan on her knees, tears streaking her face. Richard didn't move, didn't flinch. Margaret's gaze softened, not with pity for Susan, but with understanding for Richard. She placed the folder on his desk, her presence calm, grounding. Susan looked up, her vision blurred. Margaret's steady figure seemed to shine with a kind of strength Susan had never possessed. It was unbearable. "Her?" Susan choked out, her voice raw. "You choose her? Over me?" Richard turned toward Margaret, who met his gaze without flinching. There was no manipulation in her eyes, no demand, only quiet strength, the kind that said she understood his pain because she had lived her own. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and Margaret returned it. "Yes," Richard said finally, turning back to Susan. "I choose her. Not because she replaced you, but because she gave me what you never could. Respect, understanding, silence that doesn't suffocate." Susan broke then, sobbing uncontrollably, her hands clawing at the carpet as if she could pull herself back into the past. But the past was gone. The door burst open again, and Joseph strode in, his expression twisted with anger. "What is this circus? Richard, don't tell me you're letting emotions cloud your judgment. You're making a mistake. Susan belongs with me." Richard's eyes flicked to him, cold and sharp. "Belongs with you?" He stepped forward, his authority filling the room. "You couldn't even hold a position here without Susan propping you up. You mocked me for years, called me worthless, treated me as if I were beneath you, and now you stand in my office, in my company, telling me what belongs to you?" He leaned closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You belong exactly where I decide you do." Joseph's bravado faltered, but he tried one last time. "You wouldn't dare ruin my career over this." Richard's lips curved in a humorless smile. "I don't need to ruin it. You've done that yourself. Your record is mediocre at best. Without Susan covering for you, you're nothing here. Effective immediately, you're relieved of your position. Security will escort you out. Joseph's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no words came. 2 security guards appeared at the door, and he stumbled back, his arrogance collapsing under the weight of reality. He cast one last look at Susan, who still knelt on the floor, broken, then turned and left without another word. Silence settled again. Richard exhaled, his shoulders heavy but his gaze steady. He turned to Susan one last time. You wanted Joseph. Now you have nothing. You had me, and you threw me away. That was your choice. Live with it. Susan's sobs filled the room, raw and jagged, but Richard no longer bent beneath them. He turned toward Margaret, who stood quietly, waiting. She offered him a small smile, one that held no demands, only the promise of understanding. He walked to her side, and together they stepped out of the office, leaving Susan on her knees, drowning in the ruin of her own making. Behind them, the sound of her weeping echoed through the halls, but Richard didn't look back. Not this time. The days following the confrontation passed like the quiet aftermath of a storm. In the halls of the Chi conglomerate, people spoke Richard's name with reverence now. Executives who once dismissed him as a shadow behind Susan realized they had been blind. Employees who had never looked twice at him now lowered their heads in respect. Richard did not bask in the attention. He wore authority as if he had been born to it, his calm presence commanding obedience without effort. But inside, he was not celebrating. Inside, he was stitching together the wounds of 3 years wasted on a woman who never valued him. Susan did not recover so easily. She returned to work with pale cheeks and red-rimmed eyes, her once flawless posture drooping as though the weight of regret pressed down on her shoulders. Colleagues whispered behind her back, pity in their tones but no sympathy in their eyes. She had been the woman who thought she held the leash of the chairman's son, only to discover she had been choking the very man who could determine her future. Every laugh, every careless insult, every humiliating order she had given Richard replayed in her mind until the echoes became unbearable. She tried to approach him again, but the wall between them had turned to stone. In meetings, he addressed her by title only, his tone clipped and professional. Outside those walls, he ignored her entirely. The warmth that once lingered in his gaze, even when she mocked him, was gone. She found herself chasing glimpses of him in the corridor, her heart seizing when she saw him walking beside Margaret, their heads bent close in conversation. The ease between them made Susan ache with a jealousy so sharp it hollowed her out. One evening, Susan cornered him in the underground parking lot. Her heels clicked against the concrete as she ran to him, her breath unsteady. Richard, please, just hear me out one last time. He paused, hand resting on the car door, and looked at her with the same steady indifference he reserved for business opponents. There's nothing left to say, Susan. Tears welled in her eyes. You can't mean that. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. But 3 years. You gave me 3 years. Doesn't that mean anything? Richard's lips curved into a smile, but it was a sad, weary thing. He opened the car door, then reached into the back seat. When he turned, he held a worn sketchbook in his hand. Its pages were yellowed with age, edges frayed, but the childish drawings inside remained vivid. 2 figures, a boy and a girl, holding hands under the stars, running from shadows together. Susan's breath hitched. She knew the book instantly. She had tossed it aside years ago, dismissing it as nothing more than a relic of a childhood she wanted to forget. Yet Richard had kept it, treasured it, built his love on the memory it represented. He held it out now, his gaze unwavering. This, he said quietly, was the only thing of yours I ever kept, not the watches, not the cards, not the sneakers, just this, because it reminded me of the girl who once saved me, the girl who promised we'd never let go of each other. Susan's hands shook as she reached for it, her tears spilling unchecked. The weight of it in her palms crushed her. She flipped through the pages, each drawing stabbing her with memories she had buried, nights spent hiding from bullies, days spent dreaming of a future where they could be free together. She pressed the book to her chest, sobbing. Richard, I was that girl. I just lost my way. Please, let me be her again. Give me another chance. But Richard's eyes were resolute. That girl is gone. And whatever we had died with her. I'm giving this back to you because it belongs to your past. My future doesn't. He opened the car door and slid inside, his movie, immense calm, final. Susan staggered back, clutching the sketchbook as if it were her lifeline. Her sobs echoed through the empty lot as Richard drove away, the taillights vanishing into the night. From that day forward, the divide was irreversible. Richard's star rose higher with each passing month. Under his leadership, the company expanded boldly, striking partnerships that stunned the market. Margaret became an invaluable ally, her insight and quiet strength balancing Richard's sharp authority. Where Susan had belittled him, Margaret uplifted him. Where Susan had mocked his silence, Margaret found comfort in it. Slowly, Richard's heart, once scarred and raw, began to heal. He found himself drawn to her not because she filled Susan's absence, but because she mirrored his pain and chose, like him, to grow from it rather than let it consume her. Their bond deepened quietly, away from gossip and spectacle. They worked late nights together, laughter slipping through the cracks of exhaustion. They shared silences that were warm rather than suffocating, and when Richard looked at her, he saw not the shadow of a promise broken, but the possibility of a future rebuilt. Susan watched it all from the outside. Her career faltered, her reputation cracked. She tried to salvage dignity, but whispers of her downfall spread faster than she could contain them. Joseph, once her obsession, had long since abandoned her, unable to withstand the humiliation of being stripped bare by Richard's authority. She was alone now, with nothing but the sketchbook Richard had returned. Night after night, she pored over its pages, her tears smudging the pencil lines. She prayed, sometimes aloud in the solitude of her apartment, that time might reverse, that she could go back to the days when Richard's devotion was unwavering. But time moved only forward, dragging her further from the man she had lost. The final blow came. At a company gala, months later. Richard arrived hand in hand with Margaret, their presence commanding without effort. He wore his authority naturally now, his posture no longer that of a man hiding but of a leader standing firmly in his place. Margaret's smile was gentle, her gaze steady, and together they radiated the kind of quiet strength that silenced whispers. Susan stood among the crowd, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. She watched Richard laugh softly at something Margaret said, watched him bend his head closer to her, watched the way his eyes lit with warmth, a warmth she had never earned, never cherished. Her chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. Unable to bear it, she slipped out onto the balcony, the cold night air stinging her cheeks. She clutched the sketchbook to her chest, her lips trembling as she whispered to the stars, "Please, let me go back, just once, just one chance." But no answer came. The city stretched out before her, glittering and indifferent, while behind her, the sound of applause and laughter swelled. Inside, Richard raised a toast, his voice carried across the hall, calm, certain. "To the future," he said, his hand tightening gently around Margaret's. "To building something worth cherishing." The crowd cheered, and Susan, standing alone in the cold, felt her world collapse entirely. She knew then that she had lost him forever, not to fate, not to circumstance, but to her own choices. The man who once ran barefoot through storms for her now walked forward with another woman, hand in hand, never looking back. Her tears blurred the city lights into streaks of white and gold. She pressed her forehead to the sketchbook, sobbing into its worn pages. The girl who once promised never to let go, had broken that promise, and now she was the one left clinging to ghosts. Richard didn't see her that night, or perhaps he did and chose not to. Either way, he walked away with Margaret at his side, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The scars of betrayal would never fully vanish, but in Margaret's presence, they no longer ached, they reminded him only of how far he had come. And Susan remained behind, drowning in the echo of a love she had destroyed with her own hands.